welcome to everyone joining us for today's CARMA webinar, which is Perceptions of AI, Hype, Hope, or Harm. As we all know, AI is continuing to dominate headlines, boardroom agendas, and public debate. It's being presented as a breakthrough for productivity, innovation, and growth. But at the same time, it's raising important questions around trust, responsibility, risk, and reputation. Today's session is about us understanding exactly that tension. We'll be exploring findings from CARMA's latest global report on the perceptions of AI, looking at how AI is being framed in media coverage, how audiences actually feel about it, and where the gaps between media narratives and public sentiment are becoming most important for communicators. My name is Ryan Bolter. I'm a senior business consultant at CARMA, and I'm delighted to be joined today by one of my colleagues, Jennifer Sanchis, Insights and Consulting Director, who also authored the Global Perceptions of AI report. Together, we'll be discussing what the findings really mean, how trust and concern around AI are evolving, and what communications professionals should be thinking about now. In terms of the format, Jennifer will begin by walking us through some of the key findings from that report. After that, in the latter half, I'll be asking Jennifer some further questions to dig deeper into certain topics. That being said, this will also be the opportunity for me to ask Jennifer some of your questions. So we do have the chat functionality, which I've been reliably informed is active this time. So if you do have any questions as Jennifer's speaking, do put those in the chat. And then when we get to that latter half, I will look to ask Jennifer as many of those questions as I can in the time allowed. With that, though, let me hand over to Jennifer, who is going to begin by taking us through the report.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Ryan, and hello, everyone. I am delighted to present our latest study that we've conducted at CARMA about this very topic, the perception of AI on the global stage, certainly a burning topic in the United States. So is AI more built around hype, hope, or rather harm? Today, this webinar is going to answer this question. And to answer this question, we're going to look at two types of data sets, two types of signals. First, the media signals. We've conducted a thorough media analysis of about 12,000 articles of the most prominent mentions about AI and AI companies from 500 top-tier outlets from 37 markets for the whole of 2025. And secondly, we wanted to ask the general public how they perceive and feel towards AI. So we completed our media analysis with market research done in 19 markets in total with 6,300 respondents. So this is quite a holistic study with lots of data points, as you can tell. The full report is available on our website, and perhaps we could share the link on the chat. But today I'd like to walk you through a selection of some of the most important slides, which I think any PR and comms practitioners should be aware of. This study is comprised of 5 chapters in total. In chapter 1, we first looked at the overall narratives that are portrayed in media. So which narratives around AI shape media discourse the most? On this first slide that you can see, we tracked the volume of the different narratives that tend to come up very frequently in media over time, looking at the whole of 2025. As you can see, there is one narrative that tends to be dominant all year round, regardless of the different types of announcements that are made about AI. And it is this narrative that AI is seen as a productivity miracle. AI is seen as very economically transformative. There is another interesting narrative that tends to be a little bit quieter, but nevertheless remains a quite important narrative. It is the AI arms race narrative. This would typically include anything that has to do with geopolitical tensions, sovereignty debates, and you can see that it has been gradually increasing over time in 2025, and we shall certainly see more of an increase this year. This would also include the big tech escalation coverage. Every time an AI company releases a new model, anything that would cover bid or boardroom battles between Musk and OpenAI, for example. There's been a lot of discussions between the US and China, and having that competition, tension, that those narratives. For example, I'm thinking of the DeepSeek versus OpenAI narrative that was very prominent at the beginning of the year. So this would typically fall under the AI arms race narrative. And finally, I wanted to touch on this narrative that AI needs guardrails that remains consistently elevated throughout the year. The media is saying AI is powerful, but it must be managed. So one to keep in mind. But overall, what's not gaining traction is the existential threats. The Hollywood apocalypse is not the dominant frame just yet. We looked at the different types of voices that talked about AI because they very much shape the overall discourse, they shape the influence around AI. Interestingly, we noticed that the CEOs of organizations are completely owning AI discussion. So when you look at the whole of the commentary about AI from 2025, 43% of that came from CEOs. We have new generations of CEOs that are extremely newsworthy, the AI CEOs, and I'm going to touch on them in a minute. But those CEOs are very, very newsworthy, very relevant, and then tend to very much drive the conversation. If you look at the sentiment of coverage, the CEOs also tend to drive optimism, they drive positivity in media because they discuss efficiencies, they discuss productivity around AI. And you can see that compared to some of the other groups, they definitely drive those positive narratives a lot more. If you compare that with journalists, a lot more nuanced because of the topic of misinformation, disinformation, the creators as well, very impacted by AI, the NGOs, the think tanks, and also the unions, very negative towards AI because of the impact of job losses. This really makes sense, but you could see that those groups may not drive as much coverage and therefore do not resonate as much. I do want to touch on the CEOs of the top AI companies now. These CEOs have absolutely huge powers on our lives and will continue to have huge powers over our lives. We've heard more and more news recently about the use of AI for military and defense purposes, for example, and I'm thinking of the controversy between Power AI and Anthropic. We've also heard news of Zuckerberg, who started talking about virtual boards. He says that he can't really see why we can't have boards that are entirely made of AI agents. So we're now living in a very dystopian world in which the impact of their work is going to be absolutely huge. And in a world where we're witnessing a real battle in media for their outlook on AI, its risks, and its opportunities. But two things I'd like to call out here. First of all, the type of coverage that we are dealing with. The coverage about CEOs is punctuated by wars for talents, by feuds, by rivalries, and those rivalries were perfectly captured at the beginning of the year with this photo of Sam Altman and the CEO of Anthropic refusing to hold hands in a summit in India. This picture perfectly encapsulates the rivalries between some of these CEOs. The other thing is around the emergence of the good guy versus the bad guy narratives. Anthropic in 2025 was not a company that actually generated a lot of traction in media. It didn't generate a lot of visibility and didn't generate a lot of positivity either. But they suddenly made the headlines in 2026 when it decided to refuse to work with the Pentagon. So it was this event that really cemented their reputation. From a comms point of view, what does this really tell us? I think that essentially what this tells us is that the good guy narrative doesn't really cut through unless you have some really solid proof points that genuinely demonstrates your values. In chapter 2, we looked at the risk opportunity divide. Looking at the volume of opportunities versus the volume of risks that are discussed in media, regardless of the different types of announcements that were made throughout the year, we noticed that the discussion around opportunities associated with AI far outweighed the discussions around the risks. So let's look at the opportunities associated with AI first. What kind of opportunities are we talking about here? And which ones were the most prevalent? So I'm going to explain this really interesting chart now. What you're looking at is a matrix chart that has the volume of coverage around specific opportunities, and each dot represents an opportunity. And you could see that we've mapped out these different dots based on the portrait intensity of the opportunity signals. Some of these opportunities were seen as a bit more conditional. So this thing can happen if we put the right steps in place, all the way to transformational discussions about opportunity that could fundamentally change the way society operates, for example. The small dot shows you where those opportunities tracked in H1. The bigger dot shows you where those opportunities tracked in H2 2025. So what this does is that it shows you the direction of travel, and the different opportunities that we tracked seem to be accelerating in intensity over time. So that is a really interesting takeaway. And as you can see, we tracked various different opportunities from education and learning to medical innovation to creativity, efficiencies in the government sector. But the two opportunities that tended to be the most recurring opportunities, and also the opportunities that accelerated the most in terms of intensity, where economic growth and competitiveness, as well as productivity and efficiency at work. So that's very much where the hype and the hopes are. Conversely, let's look at the risks. So same thing, we looked at the volume of coverage around specific risks, and we assessed their portrayed intensity in media coverage. Each of the dots shows you a different risk. The small dot shows you H1, the bigger dot shows you H2. What's interesting is that, again, the direction of travel seems to show that the risks are becoming riskier in the eyes of the media. So it's almost like we've got a little bit of polarization there, with the opportunities being seen as more and more transformational and the risks being seen as riskier. And again, we tracked lots of different risks, from the rise of autonomous weapons to job losses, cybercriminality, spread of misinformation. But the risk that was the most discussed in media seemed to be the fact that AI systems can operate beyond meaningful human oversight. So the loss of control is very much the risk that tends to preoccupy the media the most. In chapters 3, we looked at the different emotions versus the public reaction. So we started to compare media data with market research data. Let's look at public opinion data. On this chart, we mapped out where different markets situated themselves in terms of level of excitement versus fear. So we asked people in different markets whether they felt more excited towards AI versus more scared towards AI. And we identified 4 different key groups. The first group is the strongly pro-AI markets. This would include India, China, Saudi Arabia, Brazil. Those markets are very excited about AI. Then you've got the markets that are a little bit more on the cautious side, the cautiously positive markets. This would include the US, very close to the global average, but also the UK, Mexico, South Africa, Turkey, Indonesia. So a very disparate group of markets there. Then you've got the guarded markets, which are a little bit more on the fence in terms of level of excitement and fears. And finally, the AI anxious economies. These economies tend to be a little bit more fearful towards AI and definitely more concerned than excited. Let's look at the different demographic groups now. We identified 3 different distinct groups. First, the high agency group. For this group, AI is something that they feel they can use. So typically, middle-aged respondents and male respondents feel that they can associate AI with productivity, that it is a tool that they can leverage, and they clearly have excitement towards this new technology, and they feel that AI is a tool that they can very much control. Then you've got the female respondents and the middle-aged respondents, which fall under the conditional adopter groups. For this group, excitement is present, but fear is not negligible. The attitude there very much depends on the safeguards that are put in place, on the context and the trust. Yes, AI, they're up for it, but only if it's done responsibly. And then finally, you've got the lower agency group, which would include the youngest respondents and the oldest respondents of our sample. So really interesting there. For this group, they experience AI as something that happens to them. For this group, the fear, as you can see, far outweighs excitement, and there's a perceived loss of control there, and they don't really, they see AI as a force acting on their life, and the level of agency is much, much lower there. Now, this is an incredibly interesting chart. This chart shows you the emotional signals embedded in media coverage about AI. To be completely transparent with you, we used AI to code the coverage. So we used our analysis coding capabilities in the back end, and we asked our AI model to code and understand how AI is perceived, is portrayed in media. And we gave it different options, and we asked our AI coding to assess whether readers would potentially feel excitement, trust, fear and concern, or anger or interference when looking at specific headlines, when looking at specific articles about AI. And this is what the AI came up with. Mostly excitement is the primary feeling that people could feel. Then we've got trust, and then we've got fear and concern. Now, really interestingly, we wanted to cross-check that against actual people's data. So we asked our sample, we asked the 6,500 respondents how they actually felt towards AI, what was the main emotion, and we saw some really strong alignment there between the different data sets. So what this tells me as a researcher is that when we say AI isn't really good at getting people's emotions, well, this data tells you that actually AI is pretty good at getting people's emotions. And there's definitely a strong link between what people see in the media, what they might feel as a result of it. In chapter 4, Trust, Governance and Responsibility, we started to look at who controls AI in the eyes of journalists and audiences. For this particular slide, we looked at the media mentions that attributed responsibility for the direction of AI. So who is responsible for the direction of AI, essentially? Unsurprisingly, you could see that mostly AI companies and the developers are seen as the most responsible for the direction of AI. But very interestingly, large organizations that are using AI are increasingly perceived as responsible for the direction of AI. So if you use AI today, that means that you will see more and more scrutiny for how you're using it. And obviously that will come with additional reputational pressures and definitely more scrutiny. So that it's something that you need to be aware of, definitely. So what makes people trust AI now? According to media, there are two trust aspects that tend to be recurring. It's anything that has to do with accuracy and reliability of AI outputs, but also safety and misuse prevention measures, right? So those are the two things that tend to bolster trust the most, according to media. And when we cross-check that against our market research data, we saw some alignment there. There is a little bit of an opportunity with safety and misuse prevention, as you can see, with comms that could be enhanced there. But there's definitely a lot more opportunities when it comes to transparency about how AI works. If you see the proportion of coverage on this very topic in media, it is relatively low. And you compare if you compare that against how people say they care about transparency is quite important in the eyes of the audience. So there's definitely perhaps a comms opportunity on that front. But if you do decide to communicate about transparency, I want to show you this chart because it will tell you to be very cautious. On this slide, we are looking at the different AI governance topics in media in terms of volume and sentiment, as you can see. And unsurprisingly, regulation is the number one topic when it comes to governance topics. And all of the discussion is very, very nuanced, as you can see. Ethics is the number two topic, and transparency comes third. But as you can see, transparencies or discussions around transparency are very nuanced. So if you do decide to size that PR opportunity, you also need to do it in the right way and be consistent with your messaging, because there is a risk of a bit of a backlash. Now, what makes people distrust AI, according to media? The loss of human control and the privacy dominates negative media coverage of AI. So the media isn't fearful. Well, in media, the real fear isn't the robots, it's the loss of control, right? It's the dominant trend that we've seen grow in 2025. Now, let's compare that with the audience research. Very, very interesting differences there. So probably lots of PR opportunities. It's not as much the loss of control that is the main concern. The main concern is around cybercriminality, hacking, and AI-enabled fraud, but also the spread of misinformation, deepfakes, and election interference. So from a, again, PR and comms point of view, there's probably some enhanced communications that could be done there. So the PR teams could really prioritize these risks in public-facing communication, especially when engaging with the youngest and the oldest generations of our sample. For those groups, they identified cybercriminality and misinformation as their greatest AI-related concern. In our last chapter, chapter 5, we looked at AI in the context of business. We looked at the different business implications that, that were the most discussed in media. Adoption comes most frequently as a topic in media, discussed in a very positive way. And then, as we know, we've seen lots of stories around investments, and stories around investments tend to be really, really positive in media coverage. What are the key use cases that businesses talk about the most? Mostly anything that has to do with operational efficiencies, automation, how AI is used to support decision making, all of the analytics power that it can bring, how AI can be used for content creation purposes, how it can support customer services, how it can help retrieve information, summarization, and so on. There's lots of different use cases that are discussed in media, and most of this coverage was really positive. So following these results, what could be some potential implications for large organizations? First of all, you probably want to move beyond hype and anchor your messaging in oversight. Like we've said, the dominant risk narrative is loss of control. Our clients are going to have to really give clear communication around things like governance frameworks, human oversight, and accountability mechanisms. Those things are going to be really, really critical. Large organizations might also want to start addressing the media and audience trust gap. Media overestimates a bit positivity and underestimates audience concerns around things like cybercriminality and misinformation. So comm strategies should proactively address fraud prevention and safety. You probably want to empower credible voices beyond CEOs as well. While the CEOs drive a lot of visibility and positivity, as we've seen, the over-reliance on executive narratives could risk fragility. You probably want to have more independent experts visible in your coverage, more technical leaders, perhaps operational stakeholders that could really help strengthen your credibility over time. You probably should localize your messaging by market maturity. So if you remember that matrix chart with the different markets, there are very clearly some high growth markets which may respond to transformation narratives. But if you look at the European audiences, they may require more measured narratives and stronger governance emphasis there, for example. So you really have to localize your messaging. You probably want to speak directly to generational anxieties as well. The under 20s and the over 60s feel a lot more vulnerable. So large organizations should definitely look to emphasize empowerment, emphasize digital literacy and human control rather than inevitability. You should probably reframe AI on the topic of inevitability. You should probably reframe AI from inevitability to responsibility. The next phase of AI communications will not be won by scale or valuation headlines, but it will be by demonstrating leadership, stewardship, transparency, and long-term societal alignment. So 6 clear actions that bring me to the end of this presentation. And to answer my initial question, AI, hype, hope, or harm? The truth is that it's a little bit of all three. The hype reminds us to stay critical. The hope reminds us of the potential, certainly. And the harm reminds us that there are risks that can be absolutely detrimental to what we're trying to achieve as organizations if not managed carefully. So let's be pragmatic with AI. Let's be informed to make the right decisions. And that's it for this presentation. Hand it back to you,
Thank you.
Ryan.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. And there's a few questions that I want to ask for the next 10 minutes or so, really, to drill down to a few of those topics in a little bit more detail. Before I do, though, Jennifer, I'm going to turn to a question from Christy, which was raised as you were going through the slide on the trust aspects there. So things like, for example, the public opinion shows that transparency around how AI works is really quite important to them.
Mm.
Do we or can we provide that look at those trust aspects by geography and even by those excited or fearful groups as well?
Yes, thank you, Christy. From a data point of view, that's absolutely something we can provide. If you have the right media data in place, the right market research data in place, that's absolutely something we could do. What the results really show us is that AI is seen as this black box thing. And organizations are really, really careful not to talk about these risks too much because there's a fear that we might slow adoption down. And we don't want to create hesitations. For these large organizations, they want to move away from that aspect to really embrace the more productivity-led messaging and positive storytelling. So yeah, absolutely something that that organizations can look at in terms of the data, but also should talk about a little bit more, because if organizations don't do that, if those concerns don't really show up in messaging, ultimately it doesn't reassure people. And if anything, it creates a bit of a credibility issue for these organizations. And it feels like there's probably a bit of a disconnect between what brands are saying and what audiences are actually worried about. So I appreciate that, AI is a bit of a black box, but people see through it and they want organizations to act responsibly. They don't want organizations to act perfectly, but at least show that they take those risks into account and manage them as best as they can.
I think that speaks as well to that point there about localizing messaging to market maturity as well in there.
Absolutely.
And Christy, I'm noting this as a follow-up task really in terms of that data and whether we can get that from the data we have for this report or look to include that in the future iterations as well in there. I wanted to turn, Jennifer, to that dominant media narrative you identified, and it was, and I quote, AI as a productivity miracle. Now, why do you think it was that framing that has become so powerful?
I think there's 3 reasons behind that. Firstly, productivity is simply where the most visible opportunities are. So when organizations talk about AI, the clearest and most immediate proof points are efficiencies. So how organizations do things faster, cheaper, and at scale. And those are really, really easy to demonstrate and easy for the media to pick up. Secondly, and I think that showed really nicely on that chart with the bubble charts, there's a sense of acceleration. So it's not just that AI is improving productivity, it's that there's gains that are happening really quickly, which creates this perception of intensity and reinforces the miracle framing. And thirdly, I would say that this was probably one of the most striking findings in the research. It's that there's a specific group telling the story. The CEOs are leading the conversation. If you remember that chart, 43% of commentary on AI comes from CEOs. And that level of dominance plays a huge role, obviously, in shaping the narrative around that productivity miracle, because these CEOs talk about growth, they talk about performance, and they talk about business impact ultimately.
And the thing I'm always thinking about is like, when does this start to pivot as well in there? Because one thing I think is really interesting when you look at those kind of like excited or fearful groups is that sort of the under 20s, as it was ultimately, that see this as something that AI is something that's sort of thrust upon them, that they have very little agency or autonomy over. And I can imagine probably a lot of that is to do with career opportunities moving forward in the future. And you've talked there, Jennifer, around AI being this productivity miracle when it comes to efficiencies. Sometimes we can see that efficiencies equate to, well, we don't need as much people power in a business now because AI can take that. So I think that's really interesting to see how, where does that start to pivot now? And it sort of leads me into that next question, which is not around CEOs here, where we've seen that they're so prominent at this point. Why is that? Is that because it's an investment story right now? It's a hype story right now, perhaps in there, but when do we maybe not start maybe trying to see maybe chief people officers, heads of HR, for example, getting involved in this conversation? Because they also need to start framing this conversation, right? If you're a business that's looking to adopt AI, that's looking to implement it throughout your workflows, those people probably need to be brought into the conversation, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably what's going to happen. And again, I was really surprised by the share volume, and the CEOs are leading the conversation for a number of reasons, but that might change. If you look at the reasons why the CEOs are so visible, first of all, is if you remember that chart showing the perception of responsibility towards businesses, there is an increase on that. So obviously the CEOs are seen as these key decision makers and therefore the most relevant voices in this time. But again, this might change. I think the business implications that the CEOs have been talking about as well have been so enormous, and the CEOs have been talking about these things very positively because they've talked about investment and growth and transformation, and all these things are inherently very positive, very optimistic stories, and the media will prioritize those. And also, I think the CEOs have been so visible because there's this new type of CEOs, the AI CEOs that are super newsworthy, super relevant. They are actual characters to the stories that we are seeing unfold about AI, and their rivalries, their feuds, their disagreements become really rapidly headlines. But I think with that, organizations might start to face challenges, as you've said, Ryan. So we might see more issues, for example, related to layoffs, the layoffs that are driven by AI. Do you want to throw in the CEO in the conversation? Perhaps not so much. I think what we might see as well a little bit more of going forward are concerns around AI washing. So those things could really create headwinds, and we know that the CEOs have been really owning the narrative so far, but we might want to start seeing a broader set of voices, the technical experts, the policymakers, even employees perhaps play a bigger role in shaping that conversation over the next few years.
And that's when we really get into sort of the reputational conversations as well in this, isn't it? That there's that reputational race to be seen as a pioneer in terms of AI adoption and AI use, but then also there's that responsible AI adoption and AI use as well, which is
Mm.
also going to play on there as well. The next question I have is this sort of tension between the findings of the audience research, which saw that the public is particularly worried about AI-enabled fraud,
Mhm.
cybercrime, misinformation, and deepfakes, but these concerns are underrepresented in media narratives. So, sort of two questions, if I may, here. Why are these concerns so powerful with the general public? And why don't these fears show up more in media messaging? Why isn't it proactively being tackled in the media?
Mm. Really important questions. I think it comes down to the fact that risk is simply harder to communicate than innovation. It's much easier for brands to talk about what AI can do in terms of growth, in terms of efficiency, in terms of new capabilities, because again, it fits really nicely into that positive storytelling that any com strategy has or any product launch. It's very easy to slot those messages in, whereas topics like fraud and cybercrime and election interference are much more complex. They're often less comfortable to address from these organizations' point of view. I think there's also, like I said earlier, a bit of a concern about adoption, right? So if you start talking about the risks too much too openly, then you're risking to see this adoption slow down and create hesitation, and it's probably not something you want. But the research that I've showed you shows that avoiding those topics can actually widen the trust gap. Like I've said earlier, audiences aren't expecting perfection, they're expecting responsibility. They want to know that large organizations, that brands are aware of these risks and are actively managing them as best as they can. And when those concerns, like the AI enabled fraud, um, when those concerns don't show up in messaging, it doesn't reassure people. If anything, it creates a bit of a credibility issue because it feels, again, that there's a bit of a disconnect between what brands are saying and what audiences are actually worried about. So that is really interesting. And on a slightly separate note, to put on people's radar, I have to say that I found our results around misinformation really, really interesting. So people are really worried about this phenomenon. And this is something that the Reuters Institute for Journalism has been warning us about and studying for a number of years now. For those of you who don't know what the Reuters Institute for Journalism is, it's a research organization that partners with the University of Oxford every year to publish great pieces of research about how people consume the news, how people trust the news, the state of journalism in the world, digital news consumption, all these things. So really, really in-depth piece of research. And they've established that there's more and more apathy amongst audiences who consume news, but that more importantly, people feel disconnected with what's real and what's not. And so there's a bit of a crisis of trust towards institutions, not just towards media institutions. And so positioning yourself as a trusted source of information in today's day and age is not just a box that you have to tick. It should be something that should be very much central to your com strategy at the core of your organization's DNA. You should absolutely look to tell the truth, listen to your audiences, reduce that trust gap, like I've said, communicate verified information and be consistent with it, because people need more than ever to hear credible voices, to hear trusted voices, and brands will have a huge role to play with this.
Two more questions from me before we look to wrap up at quarter past the hour Eastern time. The I know you've been presenting this report to clients as you have done today and looking through that. I always think it's the most interesting question, really. What have been some of the trends or common themes that have emerged from those conversations with existing clients when you're talking around perceptions of AI?
There's a couple of themes, but one is that comms teams, really interestingly, are starting to work much more closely with AI and technical teams. So AI is no longer just a comms narrative; it's something that requires a much deeper understanding of how it actually works, how it's being implemented, and what the real risks are and the real opportunities are. So to go back to that black box, point, there's a real need for that transparency, that comprehension of how it actually works. And so that's why we're seeing much more cross-functional collaboration there, which is really, really interesting. And the other thing that I've noticed is that it's more of a measurement and evaluation slash analysis trend. There's growing interest in using LLMs to better understand how brands are taught about or surfaced through these LLMs. So when people use ChatGPT, Perplexity, Gemini, Copilot, and so on, brands want to understand, they want to analyze the sources and the answers of these LLMs to identify the messaging, to identify perhaps emerging risks that they should be aware of. They want to start doing these LLM audits to track how they are being surfaced in various different media outlets that they may not be aware of, but they need to be aware of these conversations, these citations a little bit more. So that is also a very prominent trend that I've noticed when talking about AI with clients. So overall, comms is becoming more integrated, but also more data driven when it comes to this new technology.
The LLM analysis piece is such a big one because you
Mm-mm.
see so many bold statements, especially on LinkedIn, of guaranteeing what's going to surface you and what sort of prompts exactly going to do this. I think it's always interesting that conversation around sort of cast iron guarantees and signposting, which I say we
Mm-hmm.
sit much more on that latter part there of this is just one part of a much broader ecosystem of search and discoverability. It's a useful signpost at that point,
Mm-hmm.
rather than being a cast iron guarantee. The final question from me before we wrap up, Jennifer. I'm pleased to know this. I hope people on this webinar are pleased to know this, that there will be future iterations of this report coming. So, as we prepare for the next iteration, what are your predictions for the perceptions of AI in 2026? How will these have changed or developed from 2025?
um, there's so much hype around AI, as we know. So I think the big shift we are going to see really is it's the move from hype to proof. So more companies starting to talk about the actual quantifiable impact of AI. For a while, and as we know, it's been very aspirational when we talk about AI. There's a lot of hype, but now we're seeing more concrete examples, talks around the real efficiencies, the cost savings, the productivity gains. And in early 2026, I read a study that was shared recently that said that around a quarter of the S&P 500 companies referenced measurable impacts in their reports, which is a big jump year on year when you think about it. So that's one thing. And I think the other thing is the level of specificity as well. I'm quite close to the finance and automotive sectors, and I always find the coverage that's put out there by JP Morgan about how they use AI to optimize efficiencies on the trading floor really fascinating. There's also Bank of America, which has been really vocal, talking about how they use AI to reduce the need for large coding teams. I'm picking a completely different sector now. BMW, they've been super prominent about their use of AI in manufacturing. So using AI for things like quality control and predictive maintenance to reduce defects and improve efficiencies. So you could see that the narrative is definitely becoming more tangible, more outcomes driven, and that's probably what we're going to see more of going forward.
And I think that proof point piece is crucial, really. It's that not just doing these things to be part of the race, the AI race of sorts, but actually to really communicate the value to
Mm-mm.
clients, to employees, so on and so forth. And there's those proof points. And we've done this initiative and it's delivered X amount of time saving, or it's improved employee satisfaction, or so on and so forth, is going to be vital. Jennifer, thank you so much for going through this today, for taking questions, and thank you also to our attendees for joining us today and putting in some lovely feedback in the chat and the questions that we've had as well. So once again, I've been Ryan Bolter, Senior Business Consultant at CARMA, and Jennifer Insights and Consulting Director, has very helpfully taken us through that report. If you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out to us. We're on LinkedIn if you want to connect with us. Alternatively, there'll be a marketing email that will follow up as well. Feel free to respond to that, and that will find its way to us as well. But we will hopefully see you at the next one. Thanks again.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.